Chapter 1. By the time humanity built permanent stations beyond Neptune, most of the romance had long since drained out of space exploration. The first centuries had belonged to dreamers, astronauts, and pioneers. The centuries that followed belonged to accountants, engineers, maintenance crews, and scientists filling out grant reports from unimaginably distant outposts. Space had become less like an adventure and more like infrastructure. Cargo moved between worlds. Research stations monitored the outer solar system. Automated mining platforms harvested ice and rare elements from scattered objects drifting through the dark. Humanity had spread outward not with a triumphant leap, but with millions of small practical decisions accumulated over generations. Station 7 was one of those decisions. It rested on the surface of Charon, Pluto's largest moon, a place so distant from Earth that sunlight had become something more symbolic than useful. Even at noon, the landscape beyond the station's observation ports resembled an endless twilight. The sun hung in the sky as a brilliant star rather than a proper sun, and shadows stretched across frozen plains that had not changed in millions of years. The station itself was partially buried beneath layers of processed ice and regolith for protection against radiation and micrometeor impacts. From orbit, it appeared insignificant, little more than a cluster of geometric shapes pressed against an ancient world. Yet for the 7 people who lived there, it was an entire universe. Dr. Michael Ross often found himself standing alone in Observation Module 3 during the artificial night cycle. At 58 years old, he had spent more than 3 decades studying stellar dynamics, and he had reached an age where ambition had slowly given way to curiosity. Younger scientists still worried about awards and recognition. Michael no longer did. The universe had cured him of that. After enough years spent studying stars, a person eventually realized how small individual achievements truly were. He stood near the observation glass now, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. Beyond the station, Charon stretched away beneath a pale field of stars. Pluto hovered above the horizon, enormous and silent, its familiar heart-shaped basin faintly visible in reflected sunlight. The sight never grew old. Some landscapes exhausted themselves after repeated viewing. This one seemed to become stranger the longer he looked at it. The station was quiet. Most of the crew had settled into their evening routines. Dr. Ellen Navarro was probably reviewing geological survey data. Wei Chen would be running diagnostics on one of the communication arrays. Robert Havel likely had his nose buried in one of the history texts he carried everywhere. Their physician, Sarah Bishop, usually spent evenings exercising in the centrifuge ring. 7 people occupying a facility designed for 20 produced a peculiar kind of silence. There were always people nearby, yet vast stretches of time passed without conversation. Michael had grown fond of it. Back on Earth, silence had become increasingly rare. Here it remained abundant. A soft tone sounded from the communication console mounted against the wall. He ignored it. The station generated thousands of notifications every day. Most were routine system updates, automated observations, status reports, minor equipment issues. The tone sounded again, then a third time. That was unusual. Michael crossed the room and glanced at the display. The message waiting on the screen was short enough that he almost dismissed it immediately. Unidentified signal detected. Source: Outer Array 4. Confidence: 72%. He frowned. 72% was too high for random noise and too low for confirmation. Cosmic interference occasionally produced false positives, especially when dealing with weak signals arriving from deep space. It happened often enough that nobody became excited about it anymore. Still, protocol existed for a reason. He tapped the acknowledgement field and initiated a review. The display expanded into several windows filled with frequency graphs and waveform analyses. At first glance, the signal appeared ordinary enough. Narrowband transmission, stable carrier frequency, repeating structure, the sort of thing that might easily be generated by natural astrophysical processes. Then Michael noticed the interval spacing. He leaned closer. The pattern repeated every 67 seconds. Not approximately, exactly. His tiredness vanished. Natural phenomena tolerated imperfection. Stars fluctuated, pulsars drifted, gas clouds shifted. The universe was messy. This wasn't messy. This was precise. Michael set down his coffee. Several minutes later, he was still staring at the waveform when another voice spoke behind him. "You have the look!" He turned to find Sarah Bishop standing in the doorway. "The look?" he asked. "The one that says either something wonderful has happened or something expensive has broken." Michael pointed toward the display. Sarah stepped closer. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "That's not natural." "No." "How long have you been looking at it?" 20 minutes. "And?" "I keep hoping I'll find the mistake." Sarah folded her arms. "You should wake the others." Michael nodded. Neither moved. Beyond the glass, Pluto drifted silently above the horizon. The station suddenly felt very small. Not because anything had changed physically, but because possibility had entered the room. Human beings had spent centuries searching for evidence that they were not alone. Radio telescopes had scanned the sky. Spacecraft had explored neighboring worlds. Entire careers had been built around the search for intelligent life. The effort had persisted for so long that most people rarely thought about it anymore. The search had become background noise, a scientific tradition, something that continued because it always had. Most researchers privately assumed they would never see results during their lifetimes. Michael had certainly assumed it. Now he found himself staring at a signal arriving from somewhere beyond the edge of the solar system. Not a burst, not a transient event, a transmission. Regular, structured, intentional. The implications seemed too large to fit inside his thoughts. Sarah finally broke the silence. "If this is what we think it is?" Michael nodded slowly. "Everything changes." Within 30 minutes, the entire crew had assembled in the primary operations center. Half-finished meals sat forgotten on tables. Several still wore exercise clothing or sleep attire. Nobody complained. Nobody joked. Years of scientific training had taught them caution, but excitement lingered beneath every expression. The signal continued arriving exactly as before, steady, patient, unchanging. Like a beacon that had been waiting a very long time for someone to notice it. Hours passed. Verification procedures were repeated, equipment was tested, alternative explanations were eliminated one by one. No hardware faults, no atmospheric interference, no software errors. The source remained fixed, beyond Pluto, far beyond Pluto. Somewhere among the stars. Near dawn, station time, Robert Havel leaned back in his chair and rubbed both hands across his face. "What if we're the first?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Because everyone understood the question. Not the first humans, the first people, the first minds, the first civilization. Perhaps the signal had crossed hundreds or thousands of years before finally reaching Karen. Perhaps whoever sent it no longer existed. Perhaps entire worlds had risen and fallen during its journey through interstellar darkness. Yet somehow it had arrived here. At Station 7, on a frozen moon orbiting a dwarf planet at the edge of the solar system. 7 scientists sat in silence while the signal continued its patient repetition. Waiting, as though it had crossed unimaginable distances, carrying a message from one civilization to another. As though it had always known somebody would eventually be listening. Chapter 2. For 3 days, nobody at Station 7 slept properly. They rested in pieces, drifting in and out of narrow bands of exhaustion, lying awake in their bunks while the ventilation system whispered through the walls and the signal continued to arrive from beyond the known architecture of their lives. Even when they were away from the operations center, they could feel it. Not physically, of course. The signal did not vibrate through the hull or glow behind the closed doors. It was only information, received by antennas, filtered through instruments, rendered into lines and curves on a display. Yet it seemed to enter every room of the station. It changed the taste of coffee. It changed the sound of footsteps in the corridors. It changed the way each of them looked at the observation glass, because the stars beyond Karen no longer seemed like scenery. They seemed inhabited by intention. The first message to Earth was sent 14 minutes after Michael Ross and Sarah Bishop woke the others. The second message followed after preliminary verification. The third was written more carefully, because by then they understood that every word they transmitted would become part of history. There was a strange delay in the process, not because the message took so long to reach Earth, though it did, but because language itself seemed suddenly inadequate. Station 7 had been designed to report measurements, equipment status, survey results, radiation levels, geological anomalies, and maintenance emergencies. It had not been designed to announce that humanity had found evidence of another civilization. In the end, Wei Chen drafted the message, Michael edited it. Ellen Navarro removed 3 adjectives, and Robert Havel insisted they preserve the phrase structured non-terrestrial transmission, because, as he put it, future historians deserved at least one decent sentence. Earth received the first report nearly 5 hours later. The official response was cautious. Repeat verification, maintain data capture, restrict external communication, assemble an independent review packet, do not speculate, do not respond to the source, do not alter array orientation except as needed to preserve reception, do not discuss outside approved scientific channels. The instructions carried the calm voice of institutions trying very hard not to panic. By the time those instructions returned to Karen, the crew had already completed most of them twice. On the 4th day, the signal changed. It happened during the station's artificial morning. Michael had been sitting beside Wei in the operations center, listening to the soft click of Wei's fingernail against a ceramic cup as he studied a modulation pattern on the central display. Ellen was at the secondary console, reviewing the latest spectral comparisons, while Robert stood barefoot near the thermal printer with a blanket around his shoulders, looking less like a historian than a man who had wandered accidentally into the future before breakfast. The others were scattered through the station, close enough to be summoned, far enough to pretend they were not waiting for something impossible to happen. Then the repeating pulse ended. For nearly 7 seconds there was nothing. Wei straightened in his chair. Michael stopped breathing. The silence on the instruments felt like a door closing. Then a new pattern appeared. It was not a simple repetition. It moved in layered intervals, folding over itself in nested sequences that looked, at first, chaotic. Wei's hands moved quickly over the console. The display divided into columns, then subcolumns, then matrices. The carrier frequency remained stable, but the internal structure had changed completely. The signal was no longer announcing itself. It was doing something. "Recording?" Michael asked. "Everything," Wei said. Ellen came over from the secondary console and stood behind them, one hand resting on the back of Wei's chair. "What is it?" Wei did not answer immediately. He watched the pattern for another minute, then another, his expression tightening into the focused discomfort of a man whose mind was reaching for an explanation that did not yet exist. "It's organized," he said at last, "but not like a message, more like a directory." Robert lowered the blanket from his shoulders. "A directory of what?" Wei enlarged a section of the display. Thousands of discrete packets appeared, each tagged with recurring structural markers, each nested inside larger groupings. The pattern was elegant in a way that none of them could explain. Not beautiful exactly, but compressed, intentional, layered with internal references. Michael looked at the screen until his eyes began to water. "It's an index," he said. No one replied, because the word seemed too simple for what it implied. An index meant there was something to index. The hours that followed became the beginning of a new life for all of them. The signal no longer behaved as a beacon. It became a river. Data arrived continuously, far beyond any transmission they had ever handled from an outside source. At first, they assumed the packets must be highly redundant, perhaps repeating the same basic structure for error correction. But as Wei and the station AI began reconstructing the architecture, it became clear that the repetition was not duplication. It was reference. The transmission was not sending one message many times. It was sending many pieces of something too large to understand from the edge. By the 6th day, they had identified mathematical scaffolding. By the 9th, they found what appeared to be translation keys. By the 12th, they had extracted a sequence of diagrams so fundamental that even before they understood the symbols, they recognized the concepts: hydrogen, gravity, orbital motion, prime numbers, molecular structures, stellar classification. The civilization that sent the signal had built a bridge carefully, patiently, beginning not with language but with reality itself. It had assumed that any mind capable of receiving the archive would also know the universe. That assumption became the first act of friendship. Sarah Bishop cried when the first visual reconstruction appeared. She was not embarrassed by it. None of them were. The image was crude, uncertain, assembled from a decoding model that was still mostly guesswork. It filled the central display in gray and blue approximations, an uneven field of vertical structures rising beside what might have been water beneath a pale, dense sky. It could have been a city. It could have been a scientific diagram misread as a landscape. It could have been nothing more than their own longing projected onto alien data. Still, everyone in the room understood why Sarah covered her mouth and turned away for a moment. It was the first picture from another world. Not a telescope image, not an artist's speculation, not a planet reduced to spectral lines and orbital calculations. A picture made by someone who had stood somewhere else and wanted that place remembered. After that, the station changed. The official language remained cautious, but the private language did not. The crew stopped calling it the signal. They called it the archive. The name began with Robert, naturally, because historians were incapable of leaving things unnamed. At first, Michael resisted it, saying they did not yet know whether the transmission contained historical records. But by then the word had already settled into the station's daily speech. The archive. The thing arriving from the dark, the thing that had crossed interstellar space not as a warning, not as a threat, not as a demand, but as a preservation. Earth confirmed the terminology 2 weeks later in a classified memorandum. The Karen Extraterrestrial Archive, the document called it, CHEA, as if turning wonder into an acronym made it manageable. No one at Station 7 used the acronym unless speaking to administrators. The crew's official assignment changed within the month. Station 7 was no longer a remote survey outpost. It was now the primary reception and interpretation facility for the most important discovery in human history. Additional personnel would be sent when transfer windows allowed. New equipment would follow. Funding was being redirected. Governments were coordinating. Scientific institutions were assembling teams. Security protocols were being reviewed. Public disclosure was under consideration. Psychological support resources would be made available. Robert laughed for nearly a minute when he read that last line. Psychological support resources, he said, wiping his eyes. That's marvelous. We have discovered the cultural remains of another civilization, possibly extinct, possibly ancient beyond comprehension, and somewhere in Geneva a committee has decided what we need is a wellness packet. Sarah gave him a look. You do need a wellness packet. I need a bottle of scotch and 3 graduate students. You're getting neither. I'll settle for the scotch. You'll settle for hydration and sleep. That was how they survived the first month, with humor, routine, and the strange professional stubbornness of people trained to keep working even when awe threatened to make work impossible. They divided the archive into streams. Wei and the AI systems handled structure and error correction. Michael focused on astronomical references and source localization. Ellen compared planetary and geological data embedded in the early sequences. Robert took charge of historical classification, though he insisted it was absurd to classify a civilization whose calendar system they had not yet decoded. Sarah monitored the crew with increasing concern because discovery was wonderful, but sleep deprivation was still sleep deprivation. The 2 remaining members of Station 7, Marta Sokolov and Daniel Reyes, became indispensable in quieter ways. Marta, the station's systems engineer, kept the arrays aligned and the overworked storage systems from collapsing under the expanding flood of data. Daniel, a computational linguist whose original assignment had been to study human-machine translation drift in isolated crews, found himself suddenly facing the one task his field had dreamed of and dreaded for centuries. The first public announcement came 41 days after detection. The crew watched it together in the galley. though by then everyone already knew what would be said. Earth had delayed as long as possible, but secrecy could not survive the number of institutions now involved. The announcement was made by a coalition of scientific councils rather than any single government, a decision meant to reduce panic and increase credibility. The speaker, a calm woman with silver hair and a face Michael vaguely recognized from conferences, explained that a structured extraterrestrial transmission had been detected by Station 7 on Charon. She said the source appeared to be interstellar. She said there was no evidence of threat. She said the transmission contained organized information and that analysis was ongoing. She said this was the most significant scientific discovery in recorded history. Then she paused. It was only a small pause, perhaps 2 seconds, but everyone at the galley table felt it. "We are not alone," she said. No one at Station 7 spoke after that. On Earth, the words would be replayed endlessly. People would gather in public squares, markets would stumble, religious leaders would issue statements, children would look up at the sky. Arguments would begin within minutes and never really stop. But on Charon, where the discovery had first entered human knowledge, there was only the hum of the station and 7 tired people sitting around a table with reheated food and cooling tea. Michael looked at the others and felt something he would remember for the rest of his life. Not triumph, not fear, a kind of tenderness. They were ordinary in that moment, absurdly ordinary. Robert had sauce on his sleeve. Ellen was rubbing her eyes. Way was half asleep with his chin in his hand. Sarah sat with one knee drawn up on her chair despite station posture guidelines. Marta kept checking a maintenance alert on her wrist display because even first contact did not stop pumps from needing attention. Daniel had not touched his meal. These were the witnesses, not prophets, not chosen ones, not heroes standing beneath a blazing sky, just 7 middle-aged people at a metal table in a buried station on a frozen moon. The archive continued arriving. In the weeks after public disclosure, life became louder, even though the station itself remained physically unchanged. Requests poured in from Earth faster than anyone could answer. Every university, agency, think tank, archive, defense council, museum, and philosophical society seemed to believe it had an urgent claim on the data. The crew received messages from old colleagues, former students, journalists, family members, strangers, and people who simply wanted to say they had been alive when it happened. Some messages were beautiful. Some were deranged. Some were prayers. Some were threats. Station 7's communication filters became increasingly strict. Through it all, the archive kept unfolding. One evening, Daniel called them into the operations center with a voice so quiet that Michael knew immediately something had changed again. The others arrived in stages, drawn by tone more than urgency. Daniel stood at the central display beside a reconstruction unlike the early diagrams. It was not technical. It was not astronomical. It showed a sequence of symbols arranged around a branching structure, accompanied by repeating visual motifs. Circles within circles, paired figures, lines of descent, clusters of dwellings, recurring marks that appeared across different records. Robert stepped closer. "What are we looking at?" Daniel swallowed. "I think it's a family record." Sarah's expression changed. "An alien family?" "I don't know what family means to them," Daniel said. "But yes, something like that." The room became very quiet. Daniel advanced the reconstruction. More images appeared. They were fragmented and imperfect, but patterns emerged. Individuals grouped together across time, births or creations or origins recorded in sequences, losses marked by darkened symbols, migrations, unions, separations, names attached to recurring identities. The archive was no longer merely proving that another intelligence had existed. It was beginning to reveal that they had lived. Robert sat down slowly. "Oh," he said. It was the only word anyone had. The discovery of intelligence had been overwhelming. The discovery of culture had been historic. But this was different. A civilization could be abstract. A species could be theoretical. A signal could be analyzed. A family record could not be kept at a distance so easily. Michael stared at the branching symbols and thought suddenly of his own daughter, Claire, back on Earth, who had sent him a message after the announcement saying, "Dad, I know you're busy, but I'm proud of you." He had listened to it 6 times and had not yet answered because every response he drafted sounded insufficient. He thought of the years he had missed while pursuing work that always seemed important at the time. He thought of birthdays delayed by communication lag, of marriages strained by distance, of the way ambition often disguised itself as duty until it was too late to tell the difference. Beside him, Ellen whispered, "They wanted this remembered." No one asked how she knew. They all knew. That night, long after the others had gone, Michael remained in the operations center with the alien family record glowing softly on the display. He knew the reconstruction was probably wrong in 100 ways. He knew they were imposing human assumptions on non-human information. He knew caution was essential. Yet none of that changed the emotional fact of what he was seeing. Somewhere, impossibly far away, impossibly long ago, beings had marked their connections to one another and preserved them inside a transmission aimed at the dark. Not their triumphs first, not their weapons, not their empire. Their relationships. Michael finally opened a private channel and recorded a message to his daughter. "Claire," he began, then stopped. He sat for a long time, listening to the station breathe around him. Then he tried again. "Claire, I'm sorry I haven't answered sooner. Something happened today that made me think of you." He paused, looking at the branching lights on the display. "I think we found out they had families." Chapter 3. The second year of the archive began without fanfare, which later struck Michael Ross as strangely appropriate. History books would eventually describe those months as a turning point in human civilization, the period during which the reality of extraterrestrial intelligence ceased to be a shocking revelation and became a permanent feature of human understanding. Entire generations would grow up knowing that another civilization had once existed among the stars. Universities would be reorganized. New fields of study would emerge. Religions would adapt. Economies would absorb the implications. And political leaders would learn to speak casually about discoveries that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Yet none of that felt particularly dramatic from the surface of Charon. The station remained what it had always been. A collection of interconnected modules buried beneath ice and rock, occupied by 7 scientists who still worried about maintenance schedules, communication delays, exercise requirements, and whether the coffee recyclers were slowly degrading the flavor of every beverage they produced. The universe had changed. Their daily routines had not. The archive itself continued arriving with a patience that often felt almost deliberate. Every day new fragments emerged from the endless transmission crossing the darkness between stars. And every day those fragments added small pieces to a civilization that was gradually becoming impossible to think of as alien. During the first months after the discovery, humanity had been fascinated by the fact that another intelligence existed at all. That question had dominated discussions for generations. Were we alone? Did intelligence emerge elsewhere? Had another civilization survived long enough to build technology, explore the universe, and leave evidence of its existence? The archive had answered those questions almost immediately. What nobody had anticipated was how quickly the more interesting questions would replace them. Once the existence of the civilization became established fact, attention shifted toward understanding who they had been. The archive no longer represented proof, it represented people. Michael noticed the shift one evening while reviewing a collection of reconstructed visual records that had arrived earlier that week. The images appeared mundane by any reasonable standard. There were structures, transportation systems, public gathering places, agricultural regions, and countless examples of everyday life that carried little obvious scientific significance. Yet he found himself spending more time studying those records than he did reviewing the major discoveries. He was not alone in this. Across Earth and the inner solar system, researchers were uncovering extraordinary scientific achievements preserved within the archive, but public attention repeatedly gravitated towards simpler things. People wanted to know what meals the civilization prepared. They wanted to understand family structures, artistic traditions, celebrations, education, architecture, and personal relationships. Humanity had spent centuries imagining extraterrestrial intelligence as something radically different from itself, only to discover that the first evidence of another civilization seemed strangely occupied with many of the same concerns that filled human lives. The realization became even harder to ignore when Daniel Reyes announced what he believed to be the first confirmed educational records. Michael still remembered entering the operations center and immediately sensing that something unusual had happened. Daniel possessed a naturally restrained personality, and years of academic work had trained him to avoid dramatic declarations. Yet there was an unmistakable excitement in his expression that morning, the kind that appeared only when a researcher encountered evidence that fundamentally altered a working theory. The reconstructed sequence he presented appeared deceptively simple at first glance. A series of visual relationships repeated across multiple records showed larger individuals interacting with smaller ones, concepts being introduced, corrected, expanded upon, and revisited through what appeared to be structured instruction. None of the imagery could yet be translated with certainty, and every conclusion remained provisional. But the overall pattern grew increasingly difficult to explain as anything other than education. For nearly an hour, the 7 members of Station 7 sat together reviewing the reconstruction, discussing possible interpretations, challenging assumptions, and gradually arriving at a cautious consensus. What surprised Michael most was not the evidence itself, but the emotional reaction it produced within the room. The archive had already revealed evidence of cities, governance systems, artistic traditions, and scientific institutions. Rationally speaking, the existence of education should have been expected. A civilization capable of preserving its entire cultural history would obviously possess methods of transmitting knowledge across generations. Yet there was something profoundly human about the sight of individuals teaching the young. The concept seemed to bridge a distance that thousands of years of transmission and trillions of kilometers of empty space had failed to maintain. Robert Havel was the first to articulate what everyone appeared to be feeling. Sitting quietly at the far end of the conference table, he watched the reconstruction replay several times before leaning back in his chair and smiling to himself in a manner that suggested he had just solved a puzzle. When Ellen asked what he was thinking about, he hesitated for a moment before answering. "We're still surprised," he said. "Every time we discover something new, we're surprised that they're people." The statement produced immediate objections because it was obviously imprecise. They were not people. They were members of an entirely separate civilization that had evolved beneath a different sun and followed a completely independent path through history. Yet everyone understood what Robert meant. The surprise was not that they possessed intelligence. The surprise was that intelligence seemed to produce so many familiar outcomes. Parents taught children. Teachers instructed students. Artists created art. Historians preserved memories. Communities formed around shared values. The details differed. The underlying patterns did not. As the months passed, the growing body of evidence gradually transformed the atmosphere of the station. The original excitement surrounding the discovery evolved into something quieter and more personal. The crew found themselves discussing the civilization during meals, exercise sessions, maintenance work, and evening conversations overlooking Charon's frozen landscape. They debated philosophical questions that would have sounded absurd only a few years earlier. Did the civilization value individual achievement more than collective responsibility? How did they view mortality? What social obligations existed between generations? Did they experience nostalgia, regret, hope? The discussions rarely produced definitive answers, but that seemed less important than the fact that the questions could now be asked at all. The years also began to change the crew themselves. Originally, Station 7 had never been intended as a permanent assignment. Most deep space postings operated on predictable cycles, with personnel rotating back toward the inner solar system after completing designated terms of service. Yet the discovery of the archive complicated those plans almost immediately. Every year brought new funding, new responsibilities, new equipment, and new reasons to remain. Transfer windows were delayed, research objectives expanded, critical projects required continuity. The station grew larger as additional modules arrived, but the original 7 remained at its center. At first, each assumed the arrangement was temporary. Eventually, they stopped discussing departure dates altogether. Michael became aware of this transformation gradually, almost accidentally. One afternoon, he was participating in a routine communication session with his daughter Claire on Earth when she asked how long he expected to remain on Charon. The question should have been simple. Instead, he found himself unable to answer immediately. Years earlier, he would have responded without hesitation, citing the duration of his assignment and the expected transfer schedule. Now the future seemed strangely undefined. The archive stretched before him like an endless horizon. Every week revealed discoveries nobody had anticipated. Every month deepened mysteries that appeared increasingly significant. For the first time in his life, he realized he could imagine remaining exactly where he was. The same transformation seemed to be occurring throughout the crew. Ellen once referred to Karen as home during a conversation with her sister on Mars, and only realized what she had said after the words had left her mouth. Wei developed habits so synchronized with station life that he could identify individual crew members simply by hearing their footsteps in the corridor. Sarah knew which conversations to avoid before medical evaluations and which subjects would encourage honesty. Robert filled entire rooms with notes, diagrams, and historical theories, while increasingly behaving less like a visitor and more like a permanent resident of the outer solar system. Without ever formally deciding to do so, they had become a community. Perhaps that was why the archive resonated so deeply with them. The more they learned about the civilization hidden within the transmission, the more they encountered evidence of small communities enduring across time. Families, friendships, mentorships, partnerships, and shared traditions appeared repeatedly throughout the records. The civilization had achieved remarkable scientific and cultural accomplishments, yet the archive seemed oddly determined to preserve ordinary life alongside extraordinary achievements. Michael often found himself wondering whether that had been intentional. Whoever organized the transmission could have filled it entirely with technical information. They could have transmitted engineering designs, mathematical discoveries, and scientific breakthroughs. Instead, they had devoted enormous resources to preserving the details of daily existence: meals, conversations, celebrations, schools, homes, relationships. It was as though they understood that civilizations were not remembered through technology alone. Late in the fourth year, Daniel's team made a discovery that would quietly alter the direction of the entire project. The evidence emerged from sections of the archive that researchers had long considered incomplete. For years, analysts had suspected that portions of the civilization's history were missing, but the gaps were difficult to distinguish from ordinary transmission loss. The archive was so vast that minor discontinuities seemed inevitable. Then Daniel uncovered something different. Certain historical periods exhibited patterns that no longer resembled accidental corruption. Metadata structures pointed toward deliberate exclusion. Reference chains terminated abruptly. Entire categories of records appeared to have been systematically removed. Michael sat alone in the operations center late one evening, reviewing the preliminary report. Beyond the observation glass, Pluto drifted above the horizon, while distant stars filled the darkness. Around him, the station remained quiet. Most of the crew had already retired for the night. The only sounds came from environmental systems and the faint hum of processors handling another incoming segment of the archive. He reread the report several times, feeling a growing sense of anticipation with each pass. For years they had been reconstructing the story of an entire civilization. Now evidence suggested that someone, somewhere within that civilization, had deliberately hidden part of the ending. The realization was difficult to ignore. Every archive contained omissions. Every historical record contained biases. Every civilization concealed uncomfortable truths from future generations. Humanity certainly had. There was no reason to assume the people had been any different. Yet the scale of the omission was extraordinary. Entire centuries appeared affected. Not random centuries. The final centuries. Michael leaned back in his chair and stared at the stars beyond Charon. Somewhere within the darkness, beyond the reach of any human vessel, beyond the distances that even light required years to cross, Another civilization had chosen what future generations would remember. They had preserved their art, their families, their education, their culture, and countless details of daily life. Then, at the very end of their history, someone had started removing pieces. And for the first time since the discovery of the archive, Michael found himself wondering not only who the people had been, but what they had been trying to hide. Chapter 4. The discovery of the missing centuries changed the atmosphere of Station 7 in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to miss. Before Daniel's report, the archive had felt like a vast archaeological excavation unfolding in real time, an endless landscape of memories waiting to be uncovered and understood. The work had been challenging, certainly, but it carried a comforting assumption beneath it. The belief that, given enough patience, enough processing power, and enough years, the story would eventually reveal itself. Historians often spoke of history as a puzzle, but most puzzles possess an important characteristic. They are designed to be solved. The realization that portions of the archive appeared to have been deliberately removed introduced a different possibility altogether. Perhaps this was not a puzzle. Perhaps it was a cover-up. At first, the evidence remained frustratingly indirect. No document existed that explicitly stated records had been deleted. No confession appeared within the transmission. Instead, the proof emerged through absence, through patterns that should have existed but did not. Daniel often described the problem using an analogy from ancient human history. Imagine, he said, discovering a complete archive of 20th century Earth. There were newspapers, photographs, films, personal journals, scientific records, census data, literature, architecture, and government documents. Everything appeared intact. Then, one day, a researcher noticed that every reference to the years between 1938 and 1946 simply vanished. Entire chains of cause and effect remained visible before and after, but the central period itself had been erased. Historians would not need a confession to know something was wrong. The shape of the missing information would reveal itself through the distortions it left behind. That was exactly what they were beginning to see. The people, as humanity now universally called the civilization preserved within the archive, had documented themselves with extraordinary thoroughness for thousands of years. Researchers could trace the evolution of cities across centuries. They could follow philosophical movements, educational reforms, artistic traditions, migration patterns, and technological developments. In many respects, historians knew more about the people than they knew about some periods of humanity's own distant past. Then, roughly 300 years before the archive's final records, the continuity began to fracture. References became inconsistent. Historical narratives developed strange discontinuities. Certain individuals appeared repeatedly in earlier documents only to vanish entirely from later records. Scientific projects began but never concluded. Political institutions underwent dramatic transformations that lacked obvious explanations. The closer researchers approached the end of the civilization's history, the more gaps they encountered. The mystery consumed Robert Havel almost immediately. Michael had never seen him so animated. For years, Robert had approached the archive with the patient temperament of a historian accustomed to uncertainty. Missing information was normal. Ambiguity was expected. Historians built careers around incomplete evidence, yet this situation seemed to awaken something deeper within him. Perhaps it was because the missing centuries represented not a limitation of knowledge, but an intentional act. Someone had made a decision. Someone had looked at the accumulated memory of an entire civilization and chosen to remove part of it. The idea seemed to offend him personally. Michael often found Robert awake long after midnight station time, surrounded by visual reconstructions and historical timelines projected across the walls of his workspace. Entire sections of the room became covered in interconnected relationships as he searched for patterns hidden within the absences themselves. The irony was impossible to miss. For years, Robert had devoted his attention to the records that existed. Now he spent most of his time studying records that didn't. One evening, nearly 5 years after the discovery of the archive, Michael wandered into Robert's workspace carrying 2 cups of coffee and found the historian sitting alone in near darkness, illuminated only by hundreds of floating points of light representing historical events. The display filled the room from floor to ceiling. Cities appeared and disappeared. Cultural movements spread across centuries. Scientific discoveries connected to later developments. Family lineages branched outward through generations. The entire civilization seemed suspended around him like a three-dimensional constellation. "You planning to sleep?" Michael asked. Robert accepted the coffee without looking away from the display. "Eventually?" "That's what you said yesterday." "I was younger yesterday." Michael laughed and pulled up a chair. For several minutes neither spoke. The visualizations drifted slowly around them. Somewhere within the network lay thousands of years of history reconstructed from the archive. Somewhere within it also existed the growing shadows created by missing information. Finally, Robert gestured toward one section of the display. "Look at this." Michael leaned forward. At first he saw nothing unusual. Several major cities occupied the region. Transportation networks connected population centers. Educational institutions expanded over time. Cultural influence spread outward from urban centers. It appeared remarkably familiar. Then Robert adjusted the timeline. The simulation advanced several decades. Half the cities vanished. Not physically, historically. The record simply stopped mentioning them. Michael frowned. "Transmission loss?" "That's what I thought." Robert manipulated the display again. Additional examples appeared. Research institutions, political organizations, entire cultural movements, all fading from the historical record with no accompanying explanation. "It keeps happening," Robert said quietly. "Not randomly, selectively." Michael studied the visualization. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible, yet once seen, it became difficult to ignore. The missing information wasn't distributed evenly throughout history. Certain subjects appeared disproportionately affected. Certain regions, certain institutions, certain individuals. "What do you think they removed?" Michael asked. Robert took a long sip of coffee, then he shook his head. "That's the wrong question." Michael waited. "The question isn't what they removed." "What is it?" Robert stared at the floating network of history. "Why did they remove it?" The question lingered long after Michael left. Because Robert was right. Civilizations preserved information for reasons. They also concealed information for reasons. The motivation mattered more than the mechanism. Throughout human history, records had been altered to protect governments, preserve reputations, control populations, shape narratives, erase failures, suppress discoveries, and maintain power. The details varied. The underlying impulse remained surprisingly consistent. The people had apparently done the same. The realization unsettled Michael more than he expected. For years, humanity had unconsciously elevated the civilization into something almost mythical. The people occupied a unique place in the collective imagination. They represented the first confirmed extraterrestrial intelligence. Their archive demonstrated extraordinary foresight, cooperation, and cultural sophistication. Entire generations now studied their achievements. Yet the discovery of the missing centuries introduced something unexpected: imperfection. Not technological imperfection, moral imperfection, historical imperfection. The possibility that the people had struggled with many of the same flaws that shaped human civilizations. Oddly enough, the discovery made them feel more real. A civilization without contradictions would have seemed artificial. A civilization with secrets felt authentic. Months later, a breakthrough arrived from an unexpected direction. Daniel's linguistic models had been evolving continuously for years. Every new segment of the archive improved translation accuracy. Patterns that once required enormous interpretive effort now appeared increasingly clear. The process remained imperfect, but humanity was finally approaching something resembling genuine comprehension. One afternoon, Daniel summoned the entire crew to operations. The request itself was unusual. After 5 years, surprises had become rare. Major discoveries still occurred, but they typically emerged through gradual consensus rather than dramatic revelations. The expression on Daniel's face suggested otherwise. When everyone arrived, he stood beside the central display holding a small data tablet. For several moments he seemed uncertain how to begin. Then he activated the reconstruction. The image that appeared looked unremarkable at first. A public gathering. Several individuals standing before a larger crowd. Architectural features common throughout the archive. Nothing obviously significant. "What are we looking at?" Sarah asked. Daniel enlarged a section of accompanying text. "I think," he said carefully, "we've identified the first direct reference to the missing centuries." Nobody spoke. Daniel highlighted several translated phrases. The reconstruction remained tentative. Many portions carried low confidence ratings, yet certain concepts appeared increasingly reliable. Archive, preservation, continuity, loss, and one phrase that repeated multiple times. The Great Redaction. The room fell silent. Michael felt a chill move through him. Not because the translation was necessarily correct, because it explained too much. Redaction implied intent, deliberate removal, conscious editing. The phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the fragment. The Great Redaction. The Great Redaction. The Great Redaction. Like a historical event everyone within the civilization would have recognized immediately. Robert moved closer to the display. His voice sounded almost reverent. "My God." Daniel nodded. "That's what I thought." For years they had searched for evidence that records were missing. Now they possessed something far more significant. Evidence that the people themselves knew records were missing. The implications spread through the room almost instantly. The Great Redaction wasn't a modern discovery. It wasn't something humanity had uncovered. It was something the civilization had experienced, remembered, named, which meant the removal of information had been large enough, significant enough, and traumatic enough to become part of their own history. The question was no longer whether records had disappeared. The question was, what kind of event could compel an entire civilization to erase part of itself? Over the following weeks, researchers across the solar system focused intensely on every fragment connected to the phrase. New references emerged. Most were incomplete. Many remained difficult to interpret. Yet a rough outline slowly began forming. The Great Redaction occurred near the end of the civilization's history. It affected historical records on an unprecedented scale. Public debate surrounded the decision. Not everyone agreed with it. Some records appeared to criticize it openly. Others defended it. The event became deeply controversial. Then, frustratingly, the surviving references stopped, as though every path toward an explanation eventually encountered the same invisible wall. One night, Michael found himself standing once again in Observation Module 3. The room had changed little over the years. The stars remained unchanged. Pluto still hung above the horizon. The silence still possessed the peculiar depth unique to the outer solar system. Yet Michael felt different than the man who had first stood here on the night the signal arrived. Older, certainly, but something else as well. More connected to lives he would never live. More aware of histories he would never fully understand. The archive had expanded his sense of humanity by forcing him beyond it. Sarah entered quietly and joined him beside the glass. Neither spoke immediately. Eventually she asked, "What are you thinking about?" Michael considered the question, then smiled. "History. That's Robert's disease. It's contagious." Sarah laughed softly. They stood together watching the stars. After a while, Michael said, "I used to think first contact would answer questions." Sarah glanced at him. "And now?" "Now I think it mostly creates new ones." Outside, the darkness stretched endlessly toward the distant stars where the archive had begun its journey long ago. Somewhere within that darkness lay the civilization's final centuries. Somewhere within those missing years lay the explanation for the Great Redaction. And somewhere beyond even that, Michael increasingly suspected, waited the reason the archive had been sent in the first place. Because the more they learned, the stranger one fact became. The people had preserved almost everything. Their art, their science, their families, their history, their memories. Then they had deliberately hidden the ending. and yet they had still transmitted the archive across interstellar space, as if they wanted to be remembered, but only on their own terms. Chapter 5. By the 6th year of the archive project, Station 7 had developed its own seasons, though Charon itself possessed none. The moon remained what it had always been, a frozen world suspended in perpetual darkness at the edge of the solar system, where sunlight arrived weakened by distance and time. Yet, within the station, rhythms had emerged that felt every bit as real as spring and winter. There were periods when discoveries arrived in rapid succession, and the entire facility seemed to hum with excitement. There were quieter stretches when progress slowed, when months passed without major breakthroughs, and the crew settled into the patient work of interpretation. There were anniversaries now as well. Anniversaries of the signal's discovery. Anniversaries of the first reconstructed image. Anniversaries of the first confirmed translation. The archive had become so deeply woven into their lives that many of them measured time through it more naturally than they measured it through calendars. Michael Ross noticed this one morning while reviewing a series of personal records recently recovered from the transmission. The documents themselves were not especially remarkable. In fact, most researchers on Earth would probably have overlooked them entirely in favor of more dramatic discoveries. The records appeared to consist of individual reflections preserved over the course of a single lifetime, not historical accounts, not scientific observations, simply one individual recording thoughts, memories, concerns, hopes, and observations over many decades. Similar records had been found before, but translation quality had improved enormously over the previous few years, allowing the reconstruction teams to capture something that had often been lost in earlier efforts. Voice. Not literal voice, of course. The original language remained impossible to reproduce accurately. Yet for the first time, researchers felt they could hear personality emerging from the text. Humor, frustration, affection, regret, curiosity. The subtle emotional textures that transformed a historical figure into a person. The realization spread quickly through the station. For years, the crew had been reconstructing the broad outlines of a civilization. They had mapped cultural movements, technological progress, educational systems, artistic traditions, and social structures. They had learned how the people organized themselves, what they valued, and how they evolved across centuries. Yet civilizations are abstractions. They exist only because individual lives accumulate into larger patterns. The new records offered something different. They offered perspective from the inside. Michael spent nearly an entire afternoon reading one reconstructed journal sequence while Earth continued sending increasingly urgent requests for summary reports. The journal's author appeared to have lived during what researchers considered a relatively stable period in the civilization's history, several centuries before the Great Redaction. Nothing extraordinary happened within the surviving entries. The writer worried about family responsibilities, reflected on aging, commented on changes occurring within local communities, remembered long-dead friends, expressed concern for younger generations while simultaneously criticizing some of their habits. The experiences themselves felt astonishingly familiar. At one point, the writer described standing beside a body of water while watching a sunset and realizing that many of the people who had once shared those moments were now gone. The passage carried no great philosophical revelation. It was simply an observation about time, memory, and loss. Yet Michael found himself rereading it several times, not because it was alien, because it wasn't. That evening, the station gathered in the galley for what had gradually become an informal tradition. Every few weeks, someone selected an interesting archive discovery and presented it to the others over dinner. The gatherings began shortly after the second year and persisted because everyone secretly enjoyed them. Scientific conferences and formal briefings remained necessary, but those discussions often became dominated by technical details. The galley sessions allowed them to talk about what actually interested them. Robert arrived carrying several reconstructed documents and immediately claimed a chair near the center of the table. "This," he announced while sitting down, "is the most important thing we've discovered in months." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You say that every month." I do not. You absolutely do. Robert ignored her. The previous most important discovery was last month. This is a different month. The table erupted in laughter. Even after 6 years, some conversations followed familiar pathways. Once everyone settled, Robert activated the display. Instead of historical timelines or cultural analyses, a single reconstructed passage appeared. At first glance, it seemed disappointingly ordinary. The text described an individual cleaning and reorganizing a storage area while deciding what possessions should be preserved and what should be discarded. Nobody spoke for a moment. Finally, Ellen looked up. That's the most important discovery? Robert smiled. Keep reading. They did. Gradually, the meaning emerged. The writer wasn't describing storage. The writer was describing memory. The entire passage functioned as a metaphor for history itself. Certain experiences deserved preservation. Others faded naturally. Some memories remained painful but important. Others occupied space without providing value. The writer wondered whether individuals and civilizations faced similar responsibilities. How much should be remembered? How much should be forgotten? When the passage ended, nobody laughed. Because the connection was obvious. The Great Redaction, the missing centuries, the deliberate removal of historical records. For years, the crew had approached the mystery primarily as investigators, historians seeking facts, scientists seeking explanations. The journal suggested another possibility. Perhaps the people had viewed memory itself differently than humanity did. The discussion lasted for hours. Long after dinner ended, long after coffee replaced meals, long after the station entered its evening cycle, Sarah argued that preserving history carried moral obligations. Entire generations depended upon accurate records. Mistakes could not be avoided if memories disappeared. Robert agreed mostly, then complicated the argument by pointing out how often human societies deliberately forgot painful events. Entire cultures sometimes survived precisely because they stopped reliving historical trauma. Way contributed examples from digital preservation research, explaining how information overload had become a significant challenge even before humanity expanded beyond Earth. Archives grew faster than institutions could manage them. Selection became unavoidable. Daniel listened quietly before offering a thought that lingered with everyone afterward. What if the question wasn't what they wanted to remember? The table turned toward him. What if, he continued, the question was what they couldn't afford to remember? The room fell silent, because nobody had considered the problem from that angle. The Great Redaction had always been treated as a political decision, a historical decision, a cultural decision. But what if it represented something else? Necessity. The possibility unsettled Michael more than he expected. After the meeting ended, he found himself returning to Observation Module 3. Over the years, the room had become a place where thoughts could settle. The station contained larger spaces and more sophisticated facilities now, but he always returned to the observation glass. Outside, Pluto floated above the horizon. The stars remained unchanged. The archive continued arriving. He often thought about that last fact. The transmission never stopped. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year. The signal maintained the same patient rhythm it had exhibited on the night of its discovery. Sometimes he imagined the archive as a river flowing through darkness. Not a message sent once and received once, but a continuous act of preservation stretching across time. Somewhere in the distant past, an entire civilization had decided that its memories mattered enough to transmit them toward the stars. The scale of that decision still astonished him. Humanity often struggled to preserve records across centuries. Formats became obsolete, storage systems failed, institutions collapsed, languages evolved, yet the people had somehow created a repository capable of crossing interstellar space. A civilization had chosen to remember itself, and then, paradoxically, had chosen to forget part of itself. The contradiction remained at the center of everything. Several weeks later, another breakthrough emerged. Unlike many discoveries, this one arrived gradually rather than dramatically. Researchers had been reconstructing additional personal records from the period surrounding the Great Redaction, when subtle patterns began appearing. The records originated from different regions, different social groups, and different decades. Most shared little in common, except for one recurring theme: anxiety. Not individual anxiety, civilizational anxiety. The feeling appeared repeatedly across journals, public discussions, artistic works, and educational materials. References remained indirect, often frustratingly vague, yet the pattern grew impossible to ignore. People worried about memory. They worried about information. They worried about the accumulation of history itself. One reconstructed statement became particularly famous. Translation confidence remained moderate, but the meaning appeared relatively clear. We remember more than we can carry. The phrase spread rapidly throughout the research community, then throughout human society. Michael encountered it everywhere: news articles, academic papers, public debates, documentaries, political speeches. Someone even printed it on commemorative merchandise, which Robert described as the most human response imaginable. Yet beneath the popularity, serious questions remained. What did it mean? What burden had the people been carrying? Why did memory itself seem to become a source of concern? One evening, nearly 7 years after the signal's discovery, Daniel arrived at Michael's workspace carrying a tablet and an expression Michael recognized immediately. Another breakthrough. "Tell me something good," Michael said. Daniel sat down. "I'm not sure it's good." "That's usually when it's interesting." Daniel nodded. Then he placed the tablet on the desk. The reconstruction displayed several references connected to the same concept: different authors, different centuries, different contexts, yet all appeared to describe a similar phenomenon. The translations remained incomplete. Many details were uncertain. Still, one phrase emerged consistently enough to attract attention: memory saturation. Michael stared at the words. "What does that mean?" Daniel leaned back. "We don't know." "That's not encouraging." "No." They sat quietly for a moment. Outside the station walls, Karen drifted endlessly through darkness. Inside, processors continued decoding fragments from another world. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I think we're looking at a civilization that became afraid of its own past." Michael considered that, then shook his head. "No." Daniel frowned. "No?" "I think we're looking at a civilization that remembered something it couldn't live with." The distinction seemed small, yet somehow it felt important. Neither man spoke again for several minutes. The archive continued flowing. The missing centuries continued hiding. The Great Redaction continued resisting explanation. But for the first time, Michael felt they were approaching the edge of something larger than historical censorship or political manipulation. The fragments emerging from the final centuries carried a different emotional tone than earlier records. Not secrecy, not deception, fear. And somewhere within that fear, he increasingly suspected, lay the reason the people had edited their own history before sending it into the stars. Not because they wanted future civilizations to remain ignorant, because they wanted future civilizations to remain safe. Chapter 6. The 8th year of the archive project began with a funeral, not on Charon, not physically. The distances involved made physical attendance impossible. Nevertheless, the funeral occupied an entire day of Station 7's life, and afterward the station felt different in ways that none of the crew could fully articulate. Michael's older brother Thomas died on Earth during the early weeks of the year. The illness itself had not been unexpected. Thomas had been declining for several years, and the family had known the outcome long before the final message arrived. Even so, preparation and acceptance rarely turned out to be the same thing. Human beings often mistook foreknowledge for readiness. Michael had spent months telling himself that he understood what was coming. Then the message arrived, and he discovered that understanding offered surprisingly little protection. Because of communication delays, the funeral had already taken place by the time Michael received recordings from Earth. Family members gathered. Speeches were given. Stories were shared. Old photographs appeared on displays. Grandchildren described memories that Michael had never witnessed. Entire conversations unfolded weeks before their recordings reached Karen. By the time Michael watched them, the event itself already belonged to history. The experience left him unsettled, not because of the delay. Anyone assigned to the outer solar system eventually learned to live with delay. What unsettled him was the realization that memory itself seemed increasingly fragile. Thomas had existed for 73 years. Now his life survived only through recollection, stories, photographs, messages, fragments, the same basic materials from which historians reconstructed civilizations. For several weeks afterward, Michael found himself thinking less about his brother's death and more about the nature of remembrance. The thoughts followed him through the station as he worked. They accompanied him during meals, exercise sessions, and long periods spent reviewing incoming archive data. Again and again he found himself returning to a simple question. How much of a life actually survived? The question felt uncomfortably relevant. Because all of humanity's understanding of the people depended upon precisely that issue. The archive preserved an astonishing amount of information. It contained enough material to reconstruct thousands of years of history. Yet even after nearly 8 years of continuous study, the researchers of Station 7 remained painfully aware of how much had been lost. Every recovered document implied countless others that no longer existed. Every preserved memory suggested entire lifetimes that had vanished completely. The archive felt vast. The absence felt larger. That realization became increasingly important as Daniel's team continued investigating references connected to memory saturation and the Great Redaction. Throughout the previous year, researchers had uncovered dozens of indirect references suggesting that the civilization's relationship with memory had undergone a profound transformation near the end of its history. The problem was that nobody could determine whether the transformation was cultural, technological, psychological, or something else entirely. The surviving records described symptoms without clearly explaining causes. Individuals worried about information overload. Institutions debated preservation policies. Philosophers questioned whether memory possessed practical limits. Educational systems appeared to undergo significant reforms. Yet, the underlying catalyst remained hidden. It was like listening to one side of a conversation. The shape of the missing information became increasingly visible. The information itself remained absent. Robert often described the problem as trying to reconstruct a mountain by studying its shadow. One afternoon, he demonstrated exactly what he meant. The entire crew had gathered in a conference room overlooking one of the station's newer processing facilities. Below them, thousands of specialized systems handled incoming archive segments around the clock. The room itself was quiet, except for the soft hum of equipment and the occasional movement of projected displays. Robert stood before a massive historical timeline stretching across the wall. Years earlier, the timeline had appeared relatively straightforward. Now it resembled a battlefield. Highlighted regions, annotations, probability models, disputed interpretations, missing sections, and contradictory references covered nearly every surface. The civilization's history no longer looked incomplete. It looked damaged. Most historians spend their careers trying to understand what happened, Robert said. We're trying to understand what disappeared. He enlarged one section of the timeline. A cluster of events appeared. Scientific developments, political reforms, cultural movements, demographic changes. For a while, everything seemed normal. Then the timeline reached the period associated with the Great Redaction. The pattern changed dramatically. Entire branches terminated. Historical continuity fractured. Major institutions simply ceased generating records, not collapsed, not destroyed, silenced. Robert highlighted the affected regions. Look carefully. Michael did. The others did as well. At first, nothing obvious emerged. Then Sarah leaned forward. Oh, Robert smiled. Exactly. The missing information wasn't distributed randomly. It wasn't even distributed evenly. Specific categories had been affected far more heavily than others. Family records largely survived. Art survived. Cultural traditions survived. Educational materials survived. Even personal journals remained relatively intact. Yet certain scientific disciplines appeared devastated. Entire research programs had vanished. Large portions of technological history had disappeared. The closer records approached certain subjects, the more aggressively they seemed to encounter gaps. Daniel sat back in his chair. "We've been looking at what was removed." Robert nodded. "We should have been looking at what wasn't." The distinction proved important, because it suggested intention. Whoever performed the Great Redaction had not attempted to erase the civilization. Far from it. They had worked extraordinarily hard to preserve the civilization, its culture, its history, its people, its identity. What they had targeted appeared much narrower. Specific knowledge, specific discoveries, specific information. The realization settled heavily over the room. For years, researchers had assumed the missing centuries represented an attempt to conceal historical events. Now another possibility emerged. Perhaps the events weren't the problem. Perhaps the knowledge was. The discussion continued for hours. No consensus emerged. Too many unknowns remained. Yet by the time the meeting ended, a subtle shift had occurred. The Great Redaction no longer resembled ordinary censorship. It resembled containment. That evening, Michael returned to Observation Module 3 carrying a tablet filled with historical summaries. Outside, Pluto hovered above the horizon as it had thousands of times before. The sight remained comforting. In a universe increasingly filled with mysteries, the familiar landscape provided stability. He spent nearly an hour reviewing old notes. Many dated back years. Ideas that once seemed promising now appeared irrelevant. Theories that once dominated discussions had collapsed entirely. That was the nature of long investigations. Understanding rarely arrived in a straight line. Eventually, his attention drifted toward one of the earliest discoveries: the family records. The first family records. The records that had convinced humanity the people were more than an abstraction. Michael reopened them, not because he expected new insights, because he wanted to revisit the beginning. The reconstructed relationships appeared simple compared to modern translation models. Years of progress had dramatically improved accuracy. Still, the emotional power remained intact. Families, generations, memories, connections extending across time. As he studied the records, a thought occurred to him. A simple thought, almost embarrassingly simple, yet once it appeared, he couldn't dismiss it. The archive itself behaved like a family record. The entire transmission, all of it. A civilization had chosen to preserve itself the same way individuals preserved ancestors. Not by recording everything, by recording what mattered. Michael sat upright. His pulse quickened slightly. He activated a note file and began writing. The idea wasn't proof of anything. It wasn't even a theory. It was an observation. Yet the more he considered it, the more important it seemed. The archive had never been designed as a scientific database. Humanity kept assuming it was. That assumption shaped nearly every investigation. Researchers expected completeness, comprehensive documentation, objective preservation. But what if the archive served a different purpose? What if it wasn't intended to preserve information? What if it was intended to preserve identity? The distinction changed everything, because families didn't preserve every conversation, they preserved meaningful ones. Civilizations didn't preserve every moment, they preserved defining ones. Perhaps the archive represented memory rather than history, a civilization remembering itself. The thought lingered through the following days, then through the following weeks. Others began reaching similar conclusions independently. The pattern emerged repeatedly across research groups throughout the solar system. The archive seemed increasingly emotional in its priorities. The people had chosen what deserved remembrance. The troubling implication, of course, was obvious. If they deliberately remembered certain things, then they deliberately forgot others. Near the end of the year, Daniel's team uncovered a fragment that transformed speculation into urgency. The discovery itself appeared insignificant at first, just another damaged document recovered from a partially corrupted section of the transmission. The translation confidence remained low. Several key concepts were uncertain, yet one surviving statement stood out immediately. It appeared repeatedly across multiple fragments. Enough repetitions existed to establish confidence. Enough context survived to establish meaning. When Daniel presented the finding, nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. The phrase hovered on the display between them. Not because it was complicated, because it was terrifyingly clear. Memory is not storage. Memory is survival. The room remained silent. Michael read the phrase again. Then again. The statement felt less like philosophy and more like a warning. Sarah finally broke the silence. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered immediately, because everyone was already considering the same possibility. Memory saturation, the great redaction, the missing scientific records, the deliberate removal of knowledge, the preservation of culture, the preservation of identity, the fear visible throughout the final centuries. Suddenly those elements no longer seemed independent. They looked connected, like pieces of a larger structure beginning to emerge from fog. Robert stared at the display. If they believed memory was survival. He stopped. Nobody needed him to finish. The implication was obvious. If memory equaled survival, then excessive memory might threaten survival. And if excessive memory threatened survival, perhaps forgetting became necessary. Michael found himself looking through the observation glass toward the stars. Somewhere beyond those distant points of light existed the civilization that had sent the archive. A civilization that appeared increasingly obsessed with memory. A civilization that eventually removed vast portions of its own knowledge. A civilization that feared something enough to alter its history. And perhaps, for the first time since the signal's discovery, Michael began to suspect that the Great Redaction was not the end of the story. It was the solution. The real mystery was the problem that came before it, because civilizations did not erase centuries of knowledge without reason. Something had happened, something large enough to terrify an entire species, something powerful enough to convince them that forgetting was safer than remembering. And somewhere within the missing centuries, buried beneath absences carefully preserved across interstellar distances, waited the answer. Chapter 7. By the 9th year, the archive had become so deeply integrated into human civilization that many younger people struggled to imagine a time before its discovery. Children entering secondary schools had never lived in a universe where humanity believed itself alone. Entire university programs now existed solely to study the people. Museums maintained dedicated archive wings. Public debates about alien philosophy, culture, and history occurred with the same familiarity that earlier generations reserved for discussions of politics or economics. The initial shock had long since faded. The archive had become normal. On Charon, however, nothing about it felt normal. The 7 original members of Station 7 understood something that most people did not. The archive was not a discovery that had happened. It was a discovery that was still happening. Every day the transmission continued to arrive. Every day new fragments emerged from the darkness. Every day some small piece of an ancient civilization crossed the vast gulf between stars and entered human awareness for the first time. The process never stopped. The station never truly rested, and neither, increasingly, did the mystery. The phrase discovered during the previous year, "Memory is not storage, memory is survival," had spread rapidly through the research community. Thousands of papers attempted to explain it. Philosophers debated its implications. Cognitive scientists proposed theories. Historians revisited earlier assumptions. Entire conferences were organized around 4 translated words. Yet none of the explanations felt complete. The phrase seemed connected to something larger, something hidden, something the people had understood, and humanity did not. Michael often found himself thinking about the difference between memory and storage during his evening walks through the station. Over the years, Station 7 had expanded significantly. New research modules, habitation areas, processing centers, communication facilities, and observation platforms had been added to support the ever-growing archive project. What had once been a small outpost now resembled a permanent settlement. Yet despite the expansion, certain habits remained unchanged. Most evenings, Michael walked the same route through the older sections of the station before ending in Observation Module 3. The routine gave him time to think. More importantly, it gave him time to think without a screen in front of him. One evening, while passing through a corridor that connected several archival processing units, he stopped unexpectedly. A maintenance team had temporarily opened one of the storage chambers. Rows of quantum memory arrays stretched into the distance. The systems contained portions of the archive, petabytes, exabytes, amounts of information so vast they had ceased feeling meaningful. Michael stood there for several moments watching indicator lights pulse softly within the darkness. Information, stored, preserved, yet somehow the phrase returned to him. Memory is not storage. Memory is survival. The distinction continued bothering him, because storage was passive. Storage simply accumulated. Memory did something else. Memory selected. Memory prioritized. Memory shaped identity. A person could possess thousands of forgotten photographs stored on a device. That did not mean they remembered them. A civilization could preserve every record it had ever produced. That did not mean those records remained meaningful. The realization lingered, then expanded, and once it expanded, Michael found it impossible to ignore. The following morning, he brought the idea to Daniel. The linguist listened carefully while staring at a display filled with translation matrices. When Michael finished, Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded. "You're thinking about compression." Michael frowned. Compression. Memory isn't reality. Daniel swiveled toward him. It's a model of reality, a simplified version, useful precisely because it leaves things out. Michael considered that. Daniel continued. If you remembered every second of your life with perfect fidelity, you couldn't function. Why not? Because nothing would matter more than anything else. The statement landed with surprising force. Daniel leaned back. We think remembering everything sounds ideal because we forget things. But memory isn't designed to preserve everything. It's designed to help us survive. The phrase echoed between them. Memory is survival. Suddenly the statement felt less philosophical, more biological, more practical. Michael left the conversation unsettled, because for the first time he could imagine a scenario in which forgetting wasn't a flaw. It was a necessity. Later that week, Station 7 received what initially appeared to be another routine historical reconstruction. Similar records arrived constantly. Most contained valuable information. Few generated immediate excitement. This one changed everything. The fragment originated from a period approximately 2 centuries before the Great Redaction. Translation quality remained imperfect. Large sections were damaged. Yet enough survived to establish context. The document appeared to describe a public debate. Not a political debate, not a military debate, something broader, a civilizational debate. The topic emerged slowly through successive layers of reconstruction. At first, researchers identified references to memory systems, then references to preservation technologies, then references to information growth. By the end of the analysis, a rough outline became visible. The people had developed methods of preserving knowledge far beyond anything humanity currently possessed. The implications were extraordinary. Not because the technology itself survived, it hadn't. Most relevant technical details remained absent from the archive. What survived was the discussion surrounding it. The civilization had apparently reached a point where virtually nothing was lost. Every conversation, every document, every experience, every decision, everything could be preserved indefinitely. The conference room at Station 7 remained unusually quiet as Daniel presented the findings. Nobody interrupted. Nobody asked questions. The implications arrived too quickly, too heavily. Sarah finally broke the silence. They remembered everything? Daniel shook his head. We don't know. But they could. Possibly. The room fell silent again. Michael found himself thinking about his brother, about family memories, about old regrets, about mistakes, about grief. What would happen if none of those things faded? What would happen if every painful moment remained permanently accessible, perfectly preserved, perfectly vivid, forever? Robert rubbed his forehead. My God. Nobody disagreed, because historians spent their lives fighting against loss, yet suddenly loss appeared to possess value. The discussion continued late into the evening. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Would perfect memory improve society? Destroy it? Would individuals remain psychologically healthy? Would civilizations? Could forgiveness exist without forgetting? Could growth? Could identity? The conversation drifted into philosophy, then psychology, then history. Eventually, exhaustion forced everyone to stop. The problem remained. The following months brought additional fragments. Each added new pieces. None provided complete explanations. Yet a pattern gradually emerged. The people appeared increasingly divided during their final centuries. Not politically, not economically, philosophically. One group advocated preservation, maximum preservation, complete preservation. The belief that every experience, every discovery, every memory possessed intrinsic value. Another group argued the opposite, not for ignorance, not for destruction, for limits, for selection, for forgetting. At first, the disagreement appeared academic, then increasingly urgent, then deeply emotional. By the end of the century, references to the debate appeared everywhere. Educational systems, art, literature, personal journals, public discourse. The civilization seemed obsessed with the question. What should be remembered? The question felt strangely familiar, because humanity had spent years asking the same thing about the archive. One evening, Robert appeared at Michael's quarters carrying several reconstructed journal excerpts. The historian looked exhausted, older. The years were becoming visible on all of them now. 9 years on Charon left marks. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones, a slowing here, a hesitation there, an awareness of passing time. Robert dropped into a chair. You need to read these. Michael accepted the tablet. The entries originated from multiple individuals living during the final centuries. Different regions, different professions, different social groups, yet all described similar experiences: mental exhaustion, difficulty processing accumulated information, a sense of being overwhelmed by the weight of history itself. One passage remained with Michael long after he finished reading. The translation was incomplete, but the meaning seemed clear. Our ancestors fill every room. Michael read it again, then again. The image was haunting. Not literal ancestors. Memories, records, experiences, preserved forever, present forever, accumulating endlessly. Robert watched him. Imagine it. Michael nodded slowly. I am. No. Really imagine it. The historian leaned forward. Imagine every conversation you've ever had still available. Every mistake, every embarrassment, every argument, every regret. Perfectly preserved. Michael looked away. He didn't need help imagining it. The thought alone felt exhausting. Robert continued. Now imagine that for centuries. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Michael asked the obvious question. Do you think that's what happened? Robert stared toward the corridor. I think we're getting closer. The breakthrough arrived several months later. Not the final answer, but something approaching it. Daniel's team successfully reconstructed portions of what appeared to be a philosophical text from the period immediately preceding the Great Redaction. The document was damaged, incomplete, yet one section survived remarkably well. The translation spread through Station 7 within hours, then throughout the solar system. Michael read it alone. The words felt less like philosophy and more like a warning. A civilization may perish from ignorance, but it may also perish from memory. He sat motionless after reaching the end. Outside the observation glass, stars filled the darkness. The archive continued arriving. The station remained quiet. Yet something fundamental had shifted. For years they had assumed the Great Redaction concealed a tragedy, a war, a disaster, a collapse. Now another possibility emerged. What if the tragedy wasn't something that happened to the people? What if it was something they created? Not a weapon, not a machine, a system, a way of preserving knowledge so successful that it eventually became unsustainable. Michael found himself looking toward the stars where the archive had begun its journey. Somewhere out there, an entire civilization had confronted a problem unlike any humanity had ever faced. Not the loss of information, the abundance of it, not forgetting, remembering. And the closer the researchers of Station 7 moved toward the missing centuries, the more unsettling the possibility became. Perhaps the Great Redaction had never been about hiding the past. Perhaps it had been about surviving it. Because if a civilization remembered enough, for long enough, eventually history itself might become impossible to carry. And if that happened, forgetting might cease being a weakness. It might become the most important technology a civilization ever invents. Chapter 8. The 10th year began with snow. Not real snow, of course. Karen possessed no atmosphere capable of producing weather, and nothing resembling clouds had ever drifted across its frozen horizons. The snow appeared inside the station, projected by one of the environmental systems during a holiday gathering organized by a group of newly arrived researchers from Earth. Tiny white flakes floated gently through the central commons, dissolving before they touched the floor. Children would have immediately recognized the illusion. Adults recognized it as something else entirely, an attempt to make a distant place feel familiar. Michael stood at the edge of the gathering and watched the artificial snowfall drift through the air while conversations echoed around him. The station had changed enormously over the previous decade. Hundreds of people now passed through Station 7 each year. New facilities extended far beyond the original habitat modules. Research divisions occupied entire sectors. Communication arrays stretched across kilometers of Karen's frozen surface. What had once been an isolated outpost now functioned as the primary center for the most important scientific project in human history. Yet the original 7 remained. Not because anyone had planned it, not because anyone had ordered it, simply because none of them had ever quite found the right moment to leave. The archive had become the defining work of their lives. And perhaps, Michael sometimes suspected, the defining relationship of their lives as well. He watched Robert arguing amiably with a younger historian near one of the projection systems. Sarah was speaking with several visiting physicians. Wei was helping troubleshoot a communications display that had failed at precisely the wrong moment. Marta was almost certainly working despite being officially off duty. Daniel sat quietly at a nearby table listening to 3 conversations simultaneously, a habit he had developed years earlier. Ellen stood near one of the observation windows looking out toward Pluto. The station felt alive, more alive than it ever had. Yet beneath the activity, a quiet unease had been growing for months. The closer researchers approached the final centuries of the archive, the more troubling the picture became. The people had not simply struggled with information overload, they had become obsessed with it. References appeared everywhere now, in journals, in educational materials, in political discussions, in artistic works, in philosophical debates. Across every layer of society, evidence pointed toward a civilization wrestling with the consequences of near-perfect preservation. At first, the problem had sounded almost absurd. Humanity had spent thousands of years losing information. Entire libraries vanished, languages disappeared, historical records decayed, knowledge slipped away generation after generation. Forgetting seemed like the natural state of civilization. The people appeared to have solved that problem. Then something went wrong. The realization reminded Michael of a story he once heard from an engineer during the early years of his career. The engineer had explained that every solution eventually created new problems. Success merely changed the nature of failure. Humanity developed refrigeration and then worried about energy consumption, developed communication networks and then worried about misinformation, developed artificial intelligence and then worried about dependency. Perhaps memory followed the same pattern. Perhaps forgetting had always served a purpose. Several weeks after the holiday gathering, Daniel's team completed one of the most significant translations in the history of the project. The document arrived from a heavily fragmented region associated with the decades immediately preceding the Great Redaction. Reconstruction required nearly 4 months of continuous work. Hundreds of researchers participated. Multiple AI systems contributed. Confidence ratings remained imperfect, yet the central argument survived. And once translated, it spread through the station with astonishing speed. The text appeared to be a public address delivered by a philosopher, educator, or civic leader. The exact identity remained unclear. What survived was the message. Michael first encountered it while drinking coffee in the operations center before sunrise. At first, he intended only to skim the summary. Instead, he spent nearly 2 hours reading. The speaker described a civilization drowning in remembrance. Not metaphorically, practically. Every generation inherited the accumulated memories of countless previous generations. Historical records expanded faster than individuals could process them. Educational systems grew increasingly burdened by information preservation requirements. Cultural institutions became devoted not to creating new meaning, but to maintaining old meaning. The civilization's relationship with its past gradually shifted from stewardship to obligation. One translated passage struck Michael particularly hard. The dead no longer leave. He reread the sentence several times. Simple, elegant, terrifying. The speaker elaborated further. For most of history, death carried a certain finality. Memories survived imperfectly. Stories faded. Details disappeared. Individuals remained important without remaining present. The people had changed that. Their preservation technologies became so sophisticated that entire lives could remain accessible indefinitely. Not merely biographies, experiences, perspectives, conversations, decisions, thought patterns. The boundaries remained unclear because the relevant technical records had largely vanished, but enough survived to suggest something extraordinary. The civilization had preserved far more than information. They had preserved people. When Michael reached that conclusion, he sat back slowly. Outside the station, Karen remained silent. Inside, the implications echoed loudly enough to drown out everything else. Later that day, the original crew gathered in one of the older conference rooms. Over the years, it had become their preferred location for difficult conversations. The room lacked the sophistication of newer facilities, but familiarity carried its own advantages. Nobody spoke immediately. The translated address floated above the center of the table. Sarah finally broke the silence. They uploaded themselves. Daniel nodded cautiously. Possibly. That's a very careful answer. We don't know enough yet. But you think it's possible? Daniel folded his hands. I think some form of persistent cognitive preservation existed. Robert laughed softly. That's the most Daniel sentence ever spoken. The tension eased briefly, then returned. Because everyone understood the significance. Humanity had speculated about digital consciousness for centuries. The idea appeared repeatedly throughout fiction, philosophy, and technology research. Yet no evidence existed that it could truly work. The people appeared to have gone further, much further. The surviving records suggested that individuals might continue existing in preserved forms long after biological death. Not as memories, as participants, as contributors, as voices within society. The room remained quiet. Eventually Ellen spoke. If that's true, then every generation would inherit everyone. Nobody responded, because the statement captured the problem perfectly. Every generation would inherit everyone, the wisdom, the experience, the achievements, the mistakes, the grudges, the fears, the arguments, the unresolved conflicts, the accumulated emotional weight of centuries, forever. Michael suddenly thought about his brother. Thomas had been gone for nearly 2 years. He missed him, of course he did. Yet the grief had changed, softened, the sharp edges had worn away. Certain memories remained vivid. Others faded. New experiences gradually occupied space once dominated by loss. That process felt painful while it happened, necessary afterward. What would have happened if Thomas remained present, not remembered? Present, still capable of speaking, still capable of participating. still capable of influencing decisions. The thought unsettled him more than he expected, because part of being human involved making room for the future, and making room required space. The following months produced a cascade of related discoveries. The pieces began fitting together. Not completely, not yet, but enough to reveal the outline of something enormous. The people had developed extraordinary memory technologies. Those technologies became integrated into nearly every aspect of civilization. The preservation systems expanded continuously. Generations accumulated, records multiplied, cultural memory deepened. Then, eventually something changed. The language of the surviving documents shifted. What began as celebration became concern. What began as preservation became burden. A phrase emerged repeatedly throughout the period. At first, translators struggled with it because no direct human equivalent existed. Eventually, a rough approximation gained acceptance. Inheritance pressure. The concept appeared everywhere. Educational systems experienced it. Political institutions experienced it. Families experienced it. Individuals experienced it. Everyone lived beneath the weight of accumulated memory. The more researchers studied the concept, the stranger it seemed, because the pressure wasn't imposed by governments, or corporations, or institutions. It emerged naturally. Imagine inheriting not only wealth, property, and culture from previous generations. Imagine inheriting generations themselves, their opinions, their experiences, their expectations, their continued presence, a civilization gradually filling with voices from its own past. One evening, Michael sat alone with Robert reviewing newly translated records when the historian suddenly set down his tablet. "I think I understand." Michael looked up. "Understand what?" "The fear." Robert stared toward the observation glass. For several moments he remained silent. Then he continued. "History is supposed to become history." The statement sounded simple, yet Michael immediately understood. Historians preserved the past. They studied it, learned from it, remembered it, but they also accepted a fundamental reality. The past remained past. The people had apparently altered that relationship. The boundaries dissolved. History no longer stayed behind them. It traveled alongside them, generation after generation, century after century, accumulating, expanding, persisting. Robert shook his head slowly. My God. What? The historian looked older than Michael had ever seen him. 1,200 years. Michael frowned. 1,200 years of what? Voices. The word lingered. Voices, not records, not documents. Voices. The dead no longer leave. Suddenly the phrase returned with terrifying clarity. Months later, another fragment emerged from the period immediately preceding the Great Redaction. The translation remained incomplete. Large sections were missing. Yet one statement survived almost perfectly. Researchers spent weeks verifying it, then weeks more attempting to challenge it. The wording held. Eventually the translation entered the official archive record. Michael read it for the first time shortly after midnight. The station was quiet. Most personnel slept. Only the endless flow of incoming data continued. The statement appeared on the display before him. Brief, direct, impossible to forget. We preserved ourselves until we could no longer become ourselves. Michael stared at the words. Outside, the stars remained silent. Inside, something fundamental clicked into place. For 10 years they had searched for catastrophe, war, collapse, disaster, extinction. Instead, they had discovered a civilization struggling against success. A civilization that had solved memory, solved preservation, solved forgetting. Then discovered that forgetting had never been the problem, because memory did not merely preserve identity. Eventually, if allowed to accumulate without limit, memory could trap identity. The realization settled heavily over him. Somewhere within the missing centuries, the people had confronted that truth directly. Somewhere within the Great Redaction, they had chosen a response. And for the first time since the signal arrived on Karen, Michael found himself wondering whether humanity might someday face the same choice. Not because technology would fail, because it would succeed. Chapter 9. The 11th year began with a message that should not have existed. Michael Ross was alone in operations when it appeared. The station's night cycle had settled over the older sections of the habitat, and most of the personnel occupying the newer research modules had long since gone to sleep. Only a handful of monitoring teams remained active, watching incoming archive streams and maintaining the endless procession of processing systems that had become the beating heart of Station 7. Outside the observation ports, Karen remained unchanged, frozen and silent beneath a sky crowded with stars. Pluto hovered above the horizon like a patient companion, its familiar shape now so deeply woven into Michael's life that he could no longer imagine waking without it. The incoming fragment arrived through ordinary channels. Nothing about its reception triggered alarms. No unusual carrier patterns appeared. No system warnings activated. The data entered the archive pipeline exactly as millions of previous fragments had. Only later would historians describe the moment as one of the most important in human history. At the time, Michael almost missed it entirely. The reconstruction appeared in a queue of partially translated materials awaiting review. The metadata identified it as originating from the final decades before the Great Redaction. That alone made it worthy of attention, but not unusual. Researchers had been excavating fragments from that period for years. Michael opened the file. At first glance, it seemed incomplete. The opening sections were heavily damaged. Several paragraphs remained untranslated. Context markers were missing. Then he reached the surviving text. His eyes stopped moving. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he activated an emergency review request and called Daniel. The linguist arrived 11 minutes later. Robert followed shortly afterward. Within an hour, all 7 members of the original crew had gathered around the display. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to be the first. The fragment remained suspended before them. The translation confidence exceeded 92%. High enough to trust. High enough to frighten. The surviving text read, "The question before us is no longer whether we can preserve ourselves. The question is whether preservation has become another form of extinction." Silence settled across the room. Not the ordinary silence of researchers concentrating. Something heavier. The kind of silence that follows the appearance of an idea too large to absorb immediately. Sarah finally exhaled. "My God." No one disagreed, because for the first time the people appeared to be describing the central problem directly. Not memory, not technology. Not history, identity. The fragment continued. Much of it remained damaged, but enough survived to reveal the outline of an extraordinary debate unfolding within the civilization's final centuries. For generations, they had celebrated preservation. For generations, they had expanded it. Every breakthrough made memory more durable. Every improvement made forgetting less necessary. Eventually, the distinction between living individuals and preserved individuals began to blur, then blur further, then disappear altogether. The consequences appeared gradual, subtle, accumulating across centuries rather than years. The people did not wake one morning and discover a crisis. They slowly became trapped within one. The fragment described societies increasingly governed by accumulated experience. Every decision existed within the shadow of previous decisions. Every new generation inherited not merely history, but active participation from countless earlier generations. Innovation slowed. Cultural change slowed. Social evolution slowed. Not because anyone opposed change, because every proposed change faced the collective weight of everyone who had come before. The dead no longer left, and eventually there were too many of them. Over the following weeks, additional fragments emerged. Each added another piece. The picture grew clearer, more unsettling, more tragic. Humanity had spent years assuming the Great Redaction concealed a catastrophe. Now it appeared the catastrophe was memory itself. Not memory as humans understood it. Memory elevated into infrastructure. Memory transformed into permanence. Memory becoming impossible to escape. One reconstructed journal particularly affected Michael. The author appeared to be a teacher living during the final century before the Great Redaction. The surviving passages describe students struggling to imagine futures different from the past because every version of the past remained continuously present. Historical figures participated in educational systems. Ancestors influenced family decisions. Centuries of accumulated perspectives surrounded every discussion. The final surviving sentence lingered with Michael long after he finished reading. "We have become caretakers of ourselves, nothing more. Just that." Yet somehow, it captured the entire crisis. The civilization had become responsible for maintaining the weight of its own continuity. Not merely preserving history, preserving participation, preserving identity, preserving presence. Forever. The breakthrough arrived nearly 4 months later, not because a single fragment solved the mystery, because enough fragments finally aligned. For years, researchers had attempted to understand the Great Redaction as an event, a decision, a policy, a moment. The surviving evidence suggested something far larger. It had been a movement, perhaps the largest movement in the civilization's history. The debate spanned generations. Entire philosophical schools emerged around it. Political institutions fractured over it. Families divided over it. Artists, educators, scientists, historians, and ordinary citizens all became participants. The central question remained astonishingly simple. Should a civilization remember everything? At first glance, the answer seemed obvious. Of course it should. What possible argument could exist against preserving knowledge? Yet the people had discovered something humanity never anticipated. Perfect preservation eventually changed the nature of civilization itself. The more successful they became at remembering, the harder it became to become anything new. The debate intensified for centuries. Then eventually, one side prevailed. The evidence appeared everywhere once researchers knew how to look for it. References to release, references to renewal, references to inherited weight, references to future generations. Again and again, the same themes emerged. Not destruction, not censorship, not ignorance, freedom. The Great Redaction had not been designed to erase the past. It had been designed to return the future. The realization struck Michael while standing in Observation Module 3. The room remained unchanged after more than a decade. The same observation glass, the same stars, the same frozen horizon. Only the people had changed. Only the years. He stood alone, watching Pluto drift above the darkness while the implications settled into place. The people had not feared memory because they hated history. They feared memory because they loved possibility. A civilization unable to forget eventually became unable to change, and a civilization unable to change eventually became unable to live. The thought lingered, then expanded, then became something even more unsettling. If the Great Redaction represented their solution, another question immediately followed. Had it worked? The following month delivered the answer, or at least part of it. Daniel's team recovered the most complete document ever found from the final decades preceding the redaction. Large sections remained damaged, but enough survived to reconstruct the central argument. The text appeared to be a formal declaration, not governmental, not religious, something broader, a statement addressed to future generations, perhaps even future civilizations. The original 7 gathered together to review it. No journalists, no live broadcasts, no observers from Earth, just the people who had been present when the signal first arrived. The document unfolded slowly, carefully. The language carried extraordinary emotional weight even through imperfect translation. The authors acknowledged the achievements of their civilization, its history, its discoveries, its memories, its accumulated wisdom. Then they acknowledged the cost, the burden, the stagnation, the growing inability to create futures not already occupied by the past. Finally, near the conclusion, the statement arrived. Michael would remember reading it for the rest of his life. We were not meant to carry forever. Nobody spoke afterward. Not immediately, because the sentence felt less like an observation and more like a confession. All civilizations dreamed of permanence. The people had achieved something close to it, then discovered that permanence carried consequences. The declaration continued, The surviving fragments described a deliberate effort to reduce accumulated memory, to limit preservation, to restore uncertainty, to create space for generations not yet born. Not because the past lacked value, because the future required room. By the time the review ended, darkness had settled over the station. The original 7 remained seated around the conference table, older now, considerably older. 11 years had passed since the signal arrived. 11 years since 7 scientists gathered around an unexplained transmission emerging from the darkness between stars. None of them had expected to spend a decade pursuing a mystery. None had expected the mystery to become so personal. Eventually, Sarah broke the silence. "Do you know what bothers me?" Robert smiled faintly. "There isn't enough time to answer that question properly." A few tired laughs followed. Then Sarah continued. "They were right." Nobody answered, because everyone knew exactly what she meant. Humanity had spent centuries building systems to remember more, store more, preserve more. Yet every person in that room understood something the people apparently learned on a civilizational scale. Lives moved forward because they could not move backward. Grief softened. Mistakes faded. Generations changed. Children became different from parents. The future remained open precisely because the past was imperfectly carried. Sarah stared toward the display. "I think they were right." This time nobody laughed, because for the first time, the crew of Station 7 could see the shape of the decision that produced the Great Redaction. What they still could not see was what happened afterward. The final mystery remained untouched. The greatest mystery, the one question the archive still refused to answer. If the Great Redaction succeeded, if the people chose renewal over permanence, if they released the weight of forever, then where did they go? The transmission still ended. The civilization still disappeared, and somewhere beyond the Great Redaction, hidden behind the final veil of missing history, waited the last chapter of their story. A chapter no one had yet recovered. A chapter that Michael increasingly suspected would change everything they thought they understood. Because the more they learned about the people, the less the archive resembled a warning, and the more it resembled a farewell. Chapter 10. The final answer arrived during the 12th year, although Michael Ross would later struggle to identify the precise moment when understanding actually occurred. Looking back, it seemed less like a discovery and more like the slow emergence of a landscape from fog. For years, the researchers of Station 7 had imagined the truth waiting somewhere ahead of them, hidden within a particular document or concealed inside a final piece of evidence that would suddenly transform uncertainty into clarity. Human beings tended to think of mysteries that way. Stories taught them to expect revelations. History, however, rarely behaved so neatly. More often, understanding emerged gradually as countless fragments accumulated until an explanation became impossible to avoid. The archive had spent 12 years teaching them that lesson. It had introduced the people slowly, revealing first their existence, then their culture, then their fears, then their greatest dilemma. By the time the final pieces began falling into place, Michael realized that the answer had been visible all along. They simply had not possessed the perspective required to see it. Station 7 itself had become almost unrecognizable compared to the isolated outpost that first detected the signal. Entire sectors now stretched beneath Charon's frozen surface. Research facilities extended outward across kilometers of ancient terrain. Hundreds of scientists, technicians, archivists, historians, linguists, psychologists, and engineers lived and worked there. New arrivals often found it difficult to imagine that the most important scientific project in human history had once been managed by 7 people occupying a station designed for routine outer solar system observation. Yet despite the growth, the original 7 remained. They were older now. The years had left visible marks upon all of them. Michael's hair had become entirely white. Robert moved more carefully than he once had. Sarah complained about station lighting while secretly relying on reading glasses she insisted she did not need. Even their conversations had changed. The urgency of discovery had softened into something deeper: familiarity, friendship, shared history. They had spent more than a decade together at the edge of the solar system pursuing the memory of a civilization that no longer existed, and in the process had become a kind of civilization themselves. The breakthrough began when a series of newly reconstructed records emerged from the decades immediately following the Great Redaction. For years, researchers assumed those periods had been lost forever. The surviving evidence was sparse, fragmented, and frustratingly incomplete. Yet advances in translation systems and reconstruction techniques gradually recovered enough material to reveal something astonishing. The people had not collapsed after the Great Redaction. They had not descended into chaos. They had not suffered civilizational failure. In fact, the opposite appeared to be true. The surviving records suggested that the reforms succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Educational systems adapted. Cultural institutions transformed. New generations emerged carrying less historical burden than their ancestors. Creativity flourished. Innovation accelerated. The civilization entered what appeared to be one of the most dynamic periods in its recorded history. The discovery initially created more confusion than clarity. For years, researchers had unconsciously assumed that the Great Redaction represented the beginning of the end. The missing centuries felt ominous. The language surrounding them carried fear, anxiety, and urgency. Humanity naturally expected catastrophe, yet the evidence increasingly pointed elsewhere. The people had identified a problem, confronted it, and apparently solved it. The burden of accumulated memory diminished. The weight of perpetual preservation lifted. The future reopened, which immediately created a new mystery. If the Great Redaction worked, why did the archive still end? That question dominated Station 7 for nearly a year. The answer arrived in fragments scattered across dozens of records originating from the civilization's final centuries. No single document explained everything. Instead, the truth emerged through recurring themes. Again and again, researchers encountered discussions about continuity, identity, memory, and change. Philosophers debated the relationship between preservation and growth. Educators discussed the responsibilities owed to future generations. Historians questioned whether civilizations existed to preserve themselves or to transform themselves. The same ideas appeared across different regions, different professions, and different centuries until a remarkable picture began to emerge. The people had discovered something humanity was only beginning to understand. For thousands of years, they pursued preservation as the highest expression of survival. They built systems capable of remembering almost everything. They preserved experiences, knowledge, relationships, perspectives, and eventually portions of themselves. The achievement was extraordinary. Yet over time, they realized that survival and preservation were not the same thing. A preserved thing could remain unchanged indefinitely. A living thing could not. Living things grew, adapted, evolved, became something new. The distinction seemed simple when expressed that way. It changed everything. Michael sat with the others when Daniel finally presented the reconstructed statement that tied the entire mystery together. The room was quiet, not because anyone expected a revelation, but because 12 years of investigation had taught them patience. The document itself appeared unremarkable at first. Portions remained damaged. Several sections carried low confidence ratings. Yet the central argument survived with remarkable clarity. The authors described a realization that emerged after the Great Redaction. Their civilization had spent millennia trying to preserve itself. In doing so, they had gradually confused memory with life. The goal had never been to remain unchanged forever. The goal had always been to continue. Not continue as they were. Continue. The distinction echoed through the surviving text. Generations inherited from their ancestors, then modified what they inherited, then passed something new forward. Every civilization functioned this way. Every culture, every family. The process required both remembrance and release. Too little memory and identity vanished. Too much memory and identity became trapped. The future required inheritance. It also required space. When Michael reached the final translated section, he felt something unexpected. Not excitement, Not triumph. Relief. For 12 years they had searched for evidence of extinction. Instead, they discovered acceptance. The final statement described the archive itself, and in doing so transformed everything humanity believed about the transmission. The archive was not a preservation system. It was not an attempt to escape death. It was not a strategy for achieving immortality. It was not even intended to represent the civilization that sent it. It was a farewell. The civilization that created the archive understood that its descendants would eventually become something different. That transformation was not a tragedy. It was the natural consequence of life. Future generations would inherit their history, but they would not remain bound by it forever. The archive existed because the people wanted to remember who they had been before they became something else. They created a monument not for themselves, but for the past they were preparing to leave behind. As the implications settled over the room, nobody spoke for a long time. Outside the station, Karen continued its endless orbit around Pluto. The stars remained fixed in the darkness. The signal continued arriving exactly as it had on the night of its discovery. Yet something fundamental had changed. For the first time, Michael understood the emotional heart of the archive. Humanity had spent 12 years studying it as a record of loss. It was actually a record of growth. The people had not vanished. They had continued. Their descendants likely still existed somewhere beneath distant stars, changed by centuries of history, just as humanity had been changed by its own. Perhaps they no longer remembered the archive. Perhaps they no longer thought of themselves as the same civilization that created it. Perhaps that was precisely the point. Late that night, after the others had departed, Michael returned to Observation Module 3 for what felt like the 1,000th time. The room had accompanied every stage of the journey. He had stood there when the signal first appeared. He had stood there while the mystery deepened. He had stood there during moments of doubt, wonder, grief, and discovery. Now, 12 years later, he found himself looking once more across Karen's frozen landscape toward the distant stars. For a long time he simply watched. The universe felt no smaller than it had 12 years earlier. If anything, it felt larger. Yet it also felt strangely more familiar. Humanity had always imagined first contact as the discovery of something radically other. Instead, the first civilization they encountered had ultimately taught them something profoundly recognizable. The people feared loss. They loved memory. They worried about future generations. They struggled to balance tradition and change. They debated what should be preserved and what should be released. In the end, they discovered the same truth every parent eventually learns, every teacher eventually learns, every civilization eventually learns. The purpose of inheritance is not replication. It is continuation. Michael thought about his brother. He thought about his daughter. He thought about the friendships that had formed within Station 7. He thought about the countless lives preserved within the archive. None of them survived unchanged. None of them remained exactly as they once were. Yet something endured nonetheless. Not permanence. Not immortality. Continuity. The archive continued arriving behind him, carrying memories across unimaginable distances. Somewhere far beyond human reach, another civilization had entrusted those memories to the stars. Not because they feared being forgotten, but because they understood that remembering and moving forward were not opposites. They were partners. The realization felt unexpectedly hopeful. For 12 years, humanity searched for the fate of the people. In the end, the answer was beautifully simple. Nothing happened to them. They lived. They changed. They became something new. And by sharing their story, they left behind a gift more valuable than any technology or scientific discovery. They left behind the reminder that the purpose of history is not to preserve the past forever. The purpose of history is to help the future begin. Beyond the observation glass, the stars shone silently across the darkness between worlds. Michael watched them for a long time before finally turning away. The mystery that had defined 12 years of his life was over. The archive remained. The friendships remained. The future remained. And somewhere among those distant lights, a civilization that once feared memory had found the courage to let go.